Okay, great. So maybe I'll get us started with the land acknowledgement. We are situated on Indigenous lands of many First Nations. This sacred land has been a site of human activity for over 15,000 years, serving as the home of Indigenous people and nations long before the colonial documentation of time. The territories of the Huron-Wendat, Anishinaabeg Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nations hold space for the daily activities of every settler that resides in the meeting place of Takaranto. As a reminder, we exist in connection to the One Dish, One Spoon Treaty, and as we learn from Indigenous teachings, it is our responsibility together to protect this land. As we discuss development and planning, we must recognize how these disciplines have been made exclusive and inaccessible, and how they have been weaponized against Indigenous people across Turtle Island. Within the context of social purpose real estate, we recognize both the opportunities and limitations of this form of development as we all work towards reconciliation. Development for social purpose is not enough. It is an approach and a tool that can be used to make access to space more equitable, but there's so much more work yet to be done to see land given back to Indigenous leadership and to see housing, community space, and social infrastructure as a human right. All right, and I'll pass it over to Alex to get us started.
Thank you, Alex. So welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. This is our second of 3 webinars in the Roadmap Connect series. Today, we're talking about development finance in 2023, and we have another one coming up on December 4th that's talking about an empowered experience, how being on a board transforms and propels the careers of real estate professionals. So just a reminder that we will be recording these sessions, so feel free to turn off your cameras. And then if you missed anything, we'll be sending out the recordings shortly after, and they'll be available on our YouTube channel. So these webinars actually kick off a suite of training opportunities that will be launched in the upcoming months. And so the applications actually for our upcoming organizational readiness and accelerator programs are now available. And we have an information session coming up on December 5th. So to learn more about the session, our collaboration with CP Planning and how your organization can apply to these programs, make sure to sign up for our newsletter so you can stay in the loop for any upcoming sessions. And so, as I mentioned before, this session is brought to you in collaboration between the Infrastructure Institute and CP Planning. So before I pass it off to Cheryl, I'll give a brief introduction to the Infrastructure Institute. Next slide. So the Infrastructure Institute is a training, advisory, and interdisciplinary research hub at the University of Toronto School of Cities. Our vision is to build local and global expertise in planning for civil and social infrastructure, decision-making, and delivery. And so I'll pass it on to Cheryl now to explain more about CP Planning and the program and introduce our guest, Tristina.
Thank you so much, Alex. So great to be here. My name is Cheryl Case, founder and executive director of CP Planning. And so we are a nonprofit urban planning organization practicing a human rights approach to planning. So we've been around since about 2017. And really great to have the honor to work with communities across Ontario, Toronto, Peel, Hamilton, New York, Kitchener, and Ottawa, supporting them in their journey in supporting new affordable housing development. So this webinar series is part of that program of helping to get more affordable housing developed, and nonprofit leaders, diverse members of the sector, how can we get on board to develop more housing? So this is part of our roadmap for redevelopment plans to confront systemic racism. We just had our major project report launch on Thursday, and so we'll be sharing the link to that in the chat later on. And so, yes, as mentioned, the roadmap for redevelopment plans to confront systemic racism. We're confronting systemic racism through supporting community organizations to have greater involvement in planning. We have found that communities, they're spending a lot of time to advance affordable housing, but there's a need for greater technical knowledge within those communities. So we provide that support in terms of technical knowledge with our community planners, but we also are providing programming with such as this, where we help to bring higher level experts with greater knowledge in development on board to support these community groups to move forward. We find that community groups are wanting to see affordable housing in their neighborhoods, and it's our role to support them and seeing that through. And so this is how the Roadmap Connect program came to be. We are really excited by what we've seen from the Infrastructure Institute. And so bringing together our capacities in the roadmap to generate community engagement and investment into affordable housing with the Institute's knowledge and expertise in providing mentorship. We find that this has been a really great partnership. So today's session will be on development finance. So we know that the financing for new development is changing. It seems to be on a month-to-month basis in many ways, but we're doing our best here to just provide some additional guidance and knowledge on what is required to successfully plan for and implement the different phases of financing a new project. So our first guest is Tristina Sinopoli from SHS Consulting. You may have heard of SHS as they are very involved in generating a lot of the really great innovative affordable housing policies and programs and supporting various nonprofit organizations in their development. So Tristina is a principal of real estate development. I think we have a very great opportunity here to learn from Tristina. Thank you for joining today.
Great. Thank you so much, Cheryl and team. I'm so excited to be here. I'm just going to share my slides, so just give me 1 second here. Perfect. So hi, everybody. As Cheryl said, my name is Tristina Sinopoli with SHS Consulting, and I'm really excited to be talking to you about development finance. It's one of my favorite topics, and it's something that I think is key to advancing affordable housing forward. The question is always, well, how do you pay for it? Who's going to fund it? And it's often kind of the key missing piece needed to propel a project forward. So with that, today's agenda will be really kind of focused on kind of understanding the development pro forma and then the options for funding and financing. And I'll start at the beginning just by telling you a little bit about our team and our work. So the goals for today are really twofold. The first goal is to understand the development pro forma and the key drivers for feasibility. I'm really hoping that folks today are able to walk away with an understanding of how the capital budget works with the operating budget and how we really assess project feasibility from a funding standpoint. And then the second goal for today is to really understand the options for financing and funding, really knowing kind of the lay of the land, what's available to really help get projects started. So I'll first start by just kind of sharing a little bit about our team at SHS and the work that we've done. So we're a team of urbanists and strategists. We're really focused on creating housing solutions that foster community inclusion. This just provides kind of a high level view of some of our statistics and some of the great work that we've done across Canada over the past 30 years. Our team is divided into 3 key areas, and there's a lot of overlap between our teams. We have a business innovation team, a policy and research team, and then I sit on our housing development team where we're advancing projects. Each of our 3 areas kind of work in tandem and in sync with one another to really understand how development is impacting policy, how policy impacts development, and then from a business innovation and kind of new opportunities lens, how are new actors in the housing space kind of being given opportunities or being able to participate. So our work really kind of meshes along all of these 3 paradigms here. And today we're really going to be focusing on housing development. Our team at SHS is a kind of multi-stakeholder, multi-diverse team. We have a really cross-disciplinary team where we have backgrounds across all of the key areas here, and this helps to really kind of inform our decision-making and inform kind of the lens and approach that we bring to all of our projects. So with that, I will dive into the heart of the presentation, which is understanding the development pro forma. I'll talk a little bit about the key inputs and really help inform kind of how these key inputs work together. So when it comes to the pro forma, it's really important to understand that it is really a tool to help demonstrate whether the project is financially feasible and then sustainable into the long term. The pro forma itself actually includes multiple different budgets and pieces within it. So it includes a capital budget, which I'll get into detail in just a second, as well as an operating budget, which I'll also walk us through. Pro formas also contain cash flows. They also give us an understanding of when capital is coming into the project and when costs are being incurred. So we have an understanding of how to manage cash kind of throughout the development life cycle. You might have a $50 million project, and that doesn't mean you're writing a $50 million check the second you hit construction. There's multiple cash injection and cash disbursement points really throughout the development process. So I'm going to walk through the capital budget as well as the operating budget, because those are the kind of two key aspects that we'll be focusing on today. I will say kind of typically a pro forma is prepared by the team's project manager, maybe an internal team development manager or development director, or the development consultant. So there's different ways that different folks kind of interact with the pro forma, but it's really the development lead that's responsible for putting the budget together. Budgets are then kind of typically vetted and finalized by a quantity surveyor before the project enters into construction. Pro formas are very, very iterative. There are multiple changes that happen throughout the development lifecycle process. It's not uncommon to potentially have 50, 60, 70 iterations of a pro forma over a 2 to 3 year period when the project's in pre-development. And then right as it enters into construction, the budget is finalized once the tender has gone out and there's certainty with all of the prices presented. The way that we manage that uncertainty in the pre-development phase is really through contingency. We build in a lot of hard cost contingency and soft cost contingency to really account for the fact that a pro forma is ever evolving and ever changing. And so the contingency helps us to account for the unknowns that we might not have line of sight on in terms of cost increases into the future. So that's some advice. A pro forma is dynamic, it's going to change, and there's ways to kind of manage that as we go along. So I'm going to dive into the capital budget. So the capital budget at a really high level, it helps to determine how much the project will cost when we're looking at a new construction project. The capital budget can be adapted, so it can be for an acquisition of an existing building, or it can also be used to look at a renovation or a retrofit. For today's conversation, I'm going to focus on a new construction build with a focus on affordable rental housing. But just know that a capital budget is dynamic and it can reflect various types of capital expenses for any type of project. So what are the typical costs and inputs that we would call them for a capital budget? The first is on the soft cost side, and these are all of the costs that would go into helping develop and plan and design the building. So these are not they're not tangible. These are the creation of plans, the creation of studies. The most typical line items that we would see are design costs and professional fees, so things like the architect, engineer, development consultant, landscape architect, really any list of professionals that are providing input. It's not uncommon to see 10 to 15 different professionals providing input and advisory and consulting services as a project is kind of advancing through its design phases. The next group of costs that we typically see are site studies. And site studies are really anything related to understanding the viability of that site. So this might be an environmental study, a geotechnical study, noise, sound, a tree preservation report and study. There are a variety of studies. What we do at SHS on our side is we typically will follow the lead of the planning organization that we're working with, or the planning staff at the municipality. Typically, after you go through a pre-application consultation meeting, you'll receive a list of all of the site studies that will be required to go through a rezoning or to go through site plan application. And then we will take this list and put this into the pro forma with all of the anticipated costs of each of those site studies so that we have line of sight on what that budget looks like. But the site studies that are required are typically going to be determined by the municipality that you're working with for the various planning approvals that you're working towards. And then the other site studies, then the other soft costs are related to financing, legal, organizational, just kind of the nuts and bolts of getting the team ready from a capacity standpoint. There might be lease-up costs, there might be marketing costs. There are always legal costs when it comes to any type of organizational fee. Legal is always a cost that we make sure that groups build in, because there needs to be kind of really strong due diligence and line of sight as you're entering into any funding agreements or any agreements with lenders or any agreement with a general contractor or an architect. Legal fees are always the ones that we make sure we built in substantial budget for. And then permit fees and planning application fees. There's always a cost to applying for your planning application. There might be development charges. And so depending on what those look like, those would sit within the soft cost budget. And then from there, we go to the hard cost budget. And at the highest level, the hard costs are really the physical nuts and bolts of the building. So anything that it takes to get the site ready, whether it's remediation work, demolition of any existing structures, all of the construction costs that would go into actually building the physical building itself. And then anything related to kind of furnishing and getting the building ready. It might be appliances, furniture, equipment. This could be window coverings, security systems, and the like. Really anything that would kind of live within the physical space once it's created. And then the other cost that we call out, and this is sometimes also typically called a hard cost, is the cost of land. Whether the land is being purchased or whether there's land value at the table, we always try to account for it within the proformas so that we have an understanding of the total value of the project and the cost of the project. So the number one question that we always get is, well, how do you know? How do you know what these costs are and what do you look to? And I would say it is very iterative, and we always try to build certainty in as we go. So the first item that we would look like are any existing contracts. If we have a contract with an architect, or if we have a contract with a development consultant or any group, those contract quoted prices would go directly into the pro forma. As we do site studies, we issue requests for quotations, and so that would help to feed directly into the pro forma so that we know how much a typical environmental site assessment might cost, for example. We'll also benchmark from past projects or similar projects of size, scope, or location. That's one way that we look at costs, especially if we're not going to market to tender for something just yet. When it comes to permits and fees and the like, cities and regions are really great about posting their fee schedules online. So there is an understanding of kind of the certainty of what those fees would look like. And then on the construction side, we would typically begin with kind of high level estimates that are informed by the Altus Group's Canadian Construction Cost Guide. So this would help us just determine from a size and scope perspective, what is the typical square footage cost that we see? And then once a project advances, we would actually order a cost consultant report, either a class A through D, depending on the level of detail that's required and the level of detail of the drawing set. That helps to build more predictability and understanding of what the project budget is. And then finally, construction costs are ultimately determined by the tender prices. Once we actually go out to market, we tender the project, then we have an understanding of what those project costs are. So the construction cost number is constantly evolving, and it begins from kind of high level estimates and then gets more detailed as there's more that's known about the design and the development of the building. And then on the land side, the purchase and sale agreement, if there is going to be an acquisition, that tells us what the cost of the land will be. So those are the kind of typical pro forma inputs and how we actually get there. And now let's look at a pro forma kind of in person and kind of see kind of how this manifests. So this is a pro forma at a really, really high level. All of these numbers are illustrative, so please don't take this away and say, I have a 50 unit building, this is my pro forma. Every project is going to look different, it's going to evolve, but I didn't want to present a conceptual pro forma without actually showing you kind of what the numbers might look like on paper. So this is an example of a 50 unit affordable rental housing development in Toronto. With kind of all of the projected costs. So the pro forma that I'm showing you now is at a high level. This is kind of rolled up to all of those parent categories, if you will. But a typical pro forma will probably have upwards of 100 different lines of cost items, and those lines might grow as various components are added. So this is the high level look, but a detailed pro forma would have line by line what each cost item looks like. So once we have our pro forma, the next big question for us is, well, how do we afford this? We've looked at our pro forma. We have a project that's $37.5 million for 50 units. How might we afford this, and how do we kind of go about filling in those gaps and filling in those dots? And the place that we start with is actually the operating budget. So the operating budget tells us the long-term sustainability of a project by looking at its future operating incomes and expenses. The operating budget helps us to determine how much financing a project can support. It helps us kind of size the mortgage for the project, and it answers the question, how much can I afford? This is very typical to a traditional mortgage process for us as individuals. The first question that we ask ourselves when we're buying a home or a property is, how much can I afford based on my income? The same logic and methodology applies when it comes to rental construction. What can we afford based on the income of the building? So the operating budget would include the revenues and the expenses to give us that wholesome look of what the income looks like. On the revenue side, we would have rental income, residential or non-residential. There might be rent supplements or subsidy that's coming in from a region or municipality to help support deepened levels of affordability for the tenant group. And then there might be other revenues. There might be parking, there might be laundry or other associated costs and other associated revenues that come in. And then on the expense side, there would be utilities, maintenance, some type of property management, administration, and insurance. So these are really all of the expenses that it takes to kind of keep a building running and keep a building going. And then another expense is the capital replacement reserve. And this is an annual contribution that groups make from their budget directly to their capital reserve to help them plan for much larger repairs or replacements in the future. So it's really a reserve fund to help support the long-term sustainability of the building. On the operating budget side, the costs are kind of typically determined from industry benchmarks or any rates that might be posted online for things like property taxes or levels of affordability for rental. We also often look at existing property budgets. So if we're working with a group that currently operates housing, we might look at an existing building within their portfolio that is a kind of similar size and scope, and then normalize their existing operating budget per unit, and then take that back to the project that we're looking at with some inflation adjustments made to that. So we have a sense of this existing operator and the work that they're doing. We can also do that if there's a property management firm that the group might be contracting or an operator that the group might be contracting. It's always best to kind of use real numbers based on the lived experience of the operators that are doing this work. So we try our best to kind of right size it based on that. And then, of course, as the project gets closer and closer to operations, there might be actual contracts that we can then refer to. They might be onboarding a property management firm, signing maintenance contracts for things like snow removal or private garbage pickup or anything of that nature. So as we have those contract quotes and then the project budget becomes more and more real, then those expense numbers can be conveyed on the expense side. So that's typically how we determine the operating budget. And I'll show you what that looks like in practice. So this is, again, an example of what an operating budget looks like. So we have all of the operating revenues that come in, as well as all of the operating expenses. Something that I will note here on the operating income side is that there's always some type of allocation for vacancy loss. We can never assume that a building is always going to be 100% tenanted. So we always carry some type of cost for vacancy, knowing that there are unit turnovers. Sometimes it takes a month to turn over a unit. Sometimes it takes 2 or 3 if there's significant repairs that need to be had. So we will always build in a vacancy loss to the project operating budget so that we're taking into account the risk of not being fully tenanted 100% of the time each and every single year. And then on the projected operating side, we typically also will build in a small contingency to help account for any unknown expenses that we don't have line of sight on, or any kind of cost increases to help buffer that. So the operating budget will then give you a net operating income number once we look at the operating revenue and the operating expenses, and we subtract them to see what is left over from a net operating income standpoint. So that net operating income number, in this case, it's $499,000 or $500,000. That would then be used to help us determine the size of the mortgage that the project can support. And so for illustrative purposes, I'm just going to assume kind of a few key standards around what that mortgage might look like. So if we have a $500,000 net operating income, and we have a lender that's requiring a debt coverage ratio of 1.1, and their interest rate is 3.5% over a 50-year amortization period, hypothetically, the project would be able to support a mortgage of about $10.8 million. So what we would do is we would take that net income number, apply any of the terms and conditions of the lender that we're working with, and then right size the mortgage based on those conditions. I'll just flag that a debt coverage ratio is a number that's used to determine, based on your net operating income, how much of a mortgage, how much is left over at the end of the day once you're paying your mortgage. So the smallest debt coverage ratio that you can have is 1.0. And 1.0 means that the income that comes in directly goes to paying towards the mortgage, and there's no surplus, there's nothing left over. In the case of a 1.1 debt coverage ratio, this would mean that after you pay your mortgage, there's about 10% left in surplus that the organization either retains or uses towards the surplus of the organization. So different organizations will have different standards on what their debt coverage ratio is, and different lenders will have different requirements. Typically, if you have a commercial property, lenders might underwrite to 1.4 or 1.5 because commercial properties can be much more risky and there's risk aversion on the lender part. And then in other cases, when there's more predictable sources of income, a lender might have a much softer debt coverage ratio. For CMHC, for their National Housing Co-Investment Fund, they typically underwrite to 1.00. Some projects within that pool will underwrite to 1.05, but there's a little bit of cushion left over in the event that more capital is needed to support the project. So that's really the approach that we take to determine, based on the net income of the building, what mortgage could that property sustain, and then we work backwards from there to determine what are the other capital sources that we would need to actually fund the building. So I'm going to take us back to the project budget. So we would take that net income number and we would say, we know that we have $10.8 million, and we know that we have a building that costs $37.5 million. So we need 27.5 million more or less, or 27 million to kind of fill that gap. And then we would ask ourselves, how do we fill that gap? There's lots of different options, and I'm going to talk through what some of these are, but we might have development fee waivers and relief. So the city might grant us development fee relief that helps to soften the budget by 2.2 million. We might have land value contributed. So it's a $15 million land value. We might find a surplus site, or this might be a nonprofit that already owns their site. So that land value would be a contribution to the project. There might be provincial capital that comes into the project. There might be money that comes in from CMHC, and I'll talk through what some of these sources are in just a second. And then there might be rebates on the HST side. At the very end, once we understand all of the various sources that are available, we will then ask the question, well, now how much equity is needed to really push this project forward? Is there still a gap that the proponent or the lead organization needs to fill? And we will answer that question of what is the equity contribution. In this particular example, if we have maximized all of the funding sources available to us, we might be looking at an equity contribution of $2.2 million or $2.25 million that the proponent or the group would have to bring together either through capital raising or from their own capital reserves or investment reserves to be able to fund this project and fill that gap. So now I'll talk you through what are these options. I talked them through at a really high level here, but I want to talk them through in detail from the various perspectives of the funders at the table. So part 3, options for funding and financing. Let's talk about exactly what these options are kind of as we see them today. So I'll flag that funding and financing are key requirements for all affordable housing development. I've been in the affordable housing space for over 10 years, and I have never found a project that was just one capital source. I think all of the projects I've ever worked on have 5 to 10 capital sources. And so funding and financing at various phases of development is always key. It's never just kind of one source, one and done. There's usually lots of different aspects that are working together. The other piece that I'll flag is that funding isn't always related to the entire project as a whole or one key segment. There's sometimes funding that's just related to startup costs and paying for feasibility, paying for early due diligence. There's funding that's then needed for construction. So once we have a real project and we're ready to break ground, we need a construction financing or construction loan to actually break ground. And then finally, there's the long-term financing of the project. There's that mortgage that the annual rent, the annual net operating income works to pay. So all of these funding sources will kind of work in tandem with one another, and sometimes you'll see one convert to another. Sometimes you'll see a construction loan that then converts to a permanent loan or a term loan once the project is actually completed. I'll talk you through some of the federal, provincial, and municipal funding sources that are available. And then I'll also flag that kind of the most typical funder right now that we see for affordable housing is Canada Mortgage Housing Corporation, CMHC. And so I'll kind of talk through what some of those sources look like. So on the funding and financing side, at the federal level, so CMHC is really kind of the gold standard right now for funding affordable housing. They have the National Co-Investment Fund, which provides both grants as well as loans to projects. There was an announcement yesterday in the fall economic statement that there will be kind of further top-ups to the National Housing Co-Investment Fund starting in 2025. So we can kind of anticipate that this program will grow. I think there's some renaming that's also going to be happening. So excuse me if the slides change tomorrow based on what the new names of some of these programs might look like. But as of today, it's still called the National Housing Co-Investment Fund. There's also the rental construction financing initiative from CMHC. I haven't included that here because the program right now is largely topped up. But we do know based on yesterday's announcement that there will be more funding coming down the line for it. So that, again, that'll continuously evolve. Another funding source from CMHC is Rapid Housing Initiative. And this is a straight grant program whereby CMHC was prioritizing shovel-ready projects. And we started to see a lot of RHI projects really get off the ground, and a few of them have started to open. So it's a really great kind of grant-focused effort from CMHC. And then there's also a program called MLI Select, which is a program that's underwritten with private lenders. And then CMHC also offers seed funding for pre-development. They offer up to $150,000 in grant form. And this is to help a project really get off the ground, complete a feasibility study, do any of the site studies that they might need to do due diligence on a project. As of right now, I don't think there's any seed funding available for this current fiscal year, and we're just waiting to see if there will be a future announcement for more seed funding, because as we know, groups really, really need pre-development funding to get off the ground. So we're hoping that there will be more funding in the future to support the seed funding work. At the federal level, there's also the Community Housing Transformation Center, something called the Sector Transformation Fund. We've seen a lot of nonprofit organizations be able to tap into this fund to get support for their pre-development work, especially existing community housing providers that might be looking to expand or grow their portfolio or do something a little bit differently. We've seen that the Community Housing Transformation Center has been a great resource on the grant side for getting some of this work started. And then there's the Federation of Canadian Municipalities, FCM. They have a Green Municipal Fund. They provide both pre-development and study grant resources, as well as long-term financing and funding to projects that meet a high level of energy efficiency. And they publish all of those requirements online. And there is quite a bit of alignment between the CMHC energy requirements as well as the FCM energy requirements. So there's consistency in some of the programs that we're looking for funding. And then at the federal as well as the provincial level, there's been such great momentum around HST rebates and kind of fully rebating projects. And so that certainly definitely helps to make a project more feasible when we've been able to have kind of predictability of knowing that HST will be rebated back or not charged at all. So that's a great win for, in particular, affordable housing projects really across the board. At the provincial level, there's a few funding sources that I'll flag here. So one is called the Ontario Priorities Housing Initiative. It's commonly called OFI. These are administered through the service managers. And so York Region, Durham Region, Waterloo Region, these would be typically the service managers, and they would distribute these funds. These funds are normally posted on bids and tenders online, and there'll typically be an announcement from a region or a service manager saying they've got an allocation of $2 million in OFI funding, and there's a month window to submit that. Durham Region had theirs in October, I believe, and Waterloo Region just closed their OFI round this week. So this is kind of an annual call for applications, and we always recommend that groups kind of get ready and anticipate funding from their service manager to be able to support those projects. So that's a great grant program that's from the province but administered through regions and service managers. The Ontario Petroleum Fund also has seed grants available to groups to kind of help them get started. And then the Ministry of Health and Long-Term Care, as well as the Ministry of Children, Community and Social Services. Each of these ministries have various capital and operating subsidy programs that help to support some key aspects of housing dependent on the tenant population and kind of the level of supports and services. So again, kind of depending on the unique nature of the tenant population, depending on the support services that are provided, there might be some avenues from health and community service funders around capital and operating subsidy. We will typically work with some of our nonprofits to determine kind of which sources of funding might be the most applicable to the projects that they're working on. And then on the kind of municipal and private side, on the municipal private side, we typically see planning fee waivers, development charge waivers. There's also typically a property tax waiver. Sometimes these are waived in full. Sometimes they're partial or sometimes they're deferred. On the property tax waiver side, this really helps to boost the net operating income of the project. If you have a property tax waiver, that's one less expense, that's more income that can go towards paying a mortgage and really boosting the capital sources available to you. So that's often something that we really help to advocate for on the municipal level. And then municipalities often provide capital grants as well as rent supplements. I would also flag that municipalities and in general publicly owned sites are also kind of a really key source of funding in a way. If you can get a site for free and get a land contribution for free, this really helps to reduce the capital costs of the project because you don't have a cash outlay for the purchase of land. So that's always something that we really laud and really admire when we're able to get a publicly owned site for a group. And then on the private side, there are a variety of lenders that are providing lines of credit to support pre-development work, construction and term financing. Some of the groups that we're seeing really active in this space are Van City Community Investment Bank, as well as the High C Housing Investment Corporation, commonly called High C. So they offer kind of a variety of term financing options. We also see community foundations that are providing pre-development grants, and some of them have already begun to start investing in kind of patient capital or low interest loans to projects to really help boost that viability. And then the other piece of kind of private capital that we see are equity contributions. We work with many nonprofit organizations that will set aside some capital reserves in their budget, or they might set aside a development fund and then use this to input equity into their own projects. So again, this depends on the capacity of the organization, but I do think it's always important to flag when nonprofits are inputting equity and capital to the table, because it's such a great win to be able to apply that equity source to the project. Sometimes nonprofits will also dispose of existing sites and they'll capitalize the development fund because they have sites in their portfolio that are no longer viable or useful to them. And that's one way that they might capitalize a reserve fund or a development fund to help support new buildings, new growth in their portfolio. So I will stop there. I've got about 20 minutes left for questions. And so I hope that everybody enjoyed that presentation, and I'm really looking forward to hearing from you and hearing some of the questions that you might have.